Music. An elderly man's heartfelt plea for access to his own funds was met with an unforgiving corporate policy, and nobody could have predicted what happened next. When a 71-year-old NBA legend unexpectedly stepped in as an unlikely ally, the outcome took an entirely different turn. The scene that unfolded left everyone stunned. The heavy glass doors of First Capital Bank quivered as they were forcefully swung open, and Walter Thompson, with his weathered hands tightly clutching his wooden cane, was unceremoniously dragged toward the exit by two security guards. His worn-out leather shoes scraped noisily against the polished floor as his every step echoed in the tense silence. "Sir, I've told you 3 times already, no exceptions." The bank teller's sharp, cold voice pierced the quiet murmur of the other customers nearby, all eyes fixed on the commotion. "Without an updated digital ID, we cannot access your account, no matter how long you've been banking here." Walter's voice faltered, every word making him feel smaller, his dignity slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Please, I've been coming to this same branch every month for 30 years. Miss Sarah used to help me. She knew my face." His trembling, arthritic fingers fumbled with a collection of old papers, utility bills, his veteran's ID, and a dog-eared social security letter. As his hand quivered, the papers slipped from his grasp and fluttered across the floor like autumn leaves, scattering around him in a chaotic mess. A few bystanders took a hesitant step forward to assist him, but the security guards swiftly pushed them back. "Sir, you're creating a disturbance," one of the guards barked, his voice carrying across the cavernous lobby. "Please stop." Walter's voice cracked. His eyes filled with unshed tears, but he fought them back. "My wife's medication. The pharmacy closes at 5 o'clock. I just need to get to my pension. It's right there in my account." His plea was desperate, the pain of not being able to help his sick wife weighing heavily on him. Outside, people on the street slowed their steps, some pausing to pull out their phones, intrigued by the scene unfolding in the bank. Inside, the mood grew heavier. Other customers shifted awkwardly in their seats, some averting their eyes while others couldn't hide their growing frustration. A young mother quickly shielded her child's eyes, while an elderly woman muttered under her breath, clutching her pearls, "This isn't right. This just isn't right." "That's enough," the second security guard declared, firmly grasping Walter's elbow. "If you won't leave voluntarily, we'll have to escort you out." The fluorescent lights above seemed to magnify the tears now streaming down Walter's weathered face as he was led toward the exit. His cane clattered loudly against the marble floor with every unsteady step. The sound was like a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. His entire life, his service, his dignity, all reduced to nothing in that moment. As he was unceremoniously dumped outside the bank, the scattered papers at his feet painted only part of his story. Each document, his veteran ID, the Social Security letter, 30 years of bank statements, represented decades of hard work, sacrifice, and service. But today, none of these papers could grant him access to the one thing he needed: his own money. The reason for his desperate attempt was all too simple. His wife, Margaret, had just undergone a change in her cancer treatment regimen that morning, with the new prescription costing a staggering $486. It needed to be filled before the weekend, and their local pharmacy, Anderson's drugstore, would close at 5 o'clock sharp, only 2 hours away. Time was running out. "Mr. Thompson." A crisp voice broke through the murmurs of the crowd. It was Rebecca Stevens, the bank's newly appointed manager. At just 34, Rebecca had quickly risen through the ranks, earning her position only 3 months ago during a corporate merger. Her reputation for enforcing strict security measures had made her a star within the company. "Mr. Thompson, please," she called, stepping forward. Walter straightened up slightly, his posture rigid, his pride forcing him to stand tall. Years of coaching basketball had taught him the value of maintaining dignity, even under pressure. "I've been trying to explain to your staff," Walter said, his voice steady despite the rising frustration in his chest. "I've banked here since 1989. Every teller knew me by name. Miss Sarah, she always helped me." Rebecca gestured toward her office, modern, sleek, with glass walls that reflected the cold efficiency of the corporate world. "Come with me, Mr. Thompson." As he followed, leaning heavily on his cane, the two security guards kept a watchful distance, ensuring that nothing else would escalate. As Walter settled into the chair across from her desk, Rebecca's tone remained professional yet sympathetic. "I understand you're trying to access your pension, but it looks like you haven't completed the mandatory digital verification update." Her fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up Walter's account details. "According to our records, we've sent you 4 notifications about the changes," she continued, her eyes briefly flicking to the screen, where a red warning flashed, signaling the importance of the new policy. Walter nodded slowly, the memories of those blue letters flooding back. "Yes, those letters. Margaret tried to help me with the computer part, but—" His voice trailed off, the weight of his wife's illness becoming too much to bear. "She's been too sick lately. The chemotherapy takes so much out of her." Rebecca's eyes flickered over the new security protocols that were now mandatory for all customers. The bank had recently undergone a merger with National Financial, which brought with it stringent security updates: digital verification, two-factor authentication, biometric scanning, and smartphone app registration. These measures, according to the bank, were necessary to protect against fraud, especially for seniors. She looked up at Walter. "Unfortunately, the new system doesn't accept physical IDs anymore. You'll need to complete the digital verification through our secure app. It's a liability issue, and corporate policy is very clear on this." Turning her screen toward him, she showed him the new requirements. Walter's eyes traced the text, his grip tightening on his cane, but there was nothing he could do. The system had no room for exceptions. The new requirements were clear: a smartphone with a banking app installed, digital ID verification through a third-party service, biometric data registration, two-factor authentication setup, and digital signature enrollment. But Walter's voice cracked as he spoke, his frustration raw. "But I don't have a smartphone. Margaret and we share a simple flip phone. It was enough until today." Rebecca's fingers paused on her keyboard, her mind still haunted by the morning's email from corporate headquarters. It had been blunt, uncompromising. 0 exceptions to security protocols. Violations will result in immediate review of management positions. Her job, her future, even her mortgage. All of it depended on flawless compliance with the new system. "Perhaps a family member could assist in setting up the digital verification," Rebecca suggested, knowing all too well that the process would take days to complete. Walter's gaze met hers. His eyes filled with a mixture of years of wisdom, worry, and quiet resolve. "My son's stationed in Germany. Margaret's sister is flying in next week to help with her care, but—" His voice faltered as he placed the prescription slip on her desk. "This can't wait until next week." The bank's new policies loomed like an impenetrable wall between them. As Rebecca scanned Walter's account information on her screen, she could see the decades of careful savings, regular deposits, never an overdraft. But the red warning banner at the top of the screen declared, "Unverified account access restricted." Outside, the lobby had quieted, and more customers had begun to notice the scene unfolding inside. Many recognized Walter, the coach who had spent countless evenings in the old gym, who'd bought uniforms for kids who couldn't afford them, who'd written college recommendations and attended graduations long after his students had left his team. He was more than just a customer. He was a community pillar. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly toward 5 p.m., the deadline for Margaret's medication drawing nearer. Ironically, the very system designed to protect people like Walter had now become the thing that threatened his family's well-being. Rebecca stood, her mind made up. Walter's insistence on needing the money had started to feel like an inconvenience to her and her staff, so much so that she felt it was best to have him removed from the premises. But just as that decision was forming in her mind, Shaquille O'Neal and his teenage daughter Mahira pulled up to the bank's parking lot. As they made their way toward the entrance, they noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench just outside the side entrance of the bank. His shoulders trembled with quiet sobs, his weathered hands gripping his cane tightly. The sight of an elderly man crying in public, especially outside a bank, was rare. Mahira tugged at her father's sleeve. Her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, look." Shaq's 7-foot frame cast a long shadow over the scene as he paused, noticing the man's distress. His deep voice, surprisingly gentle, broke through the quiet. "Sir, are you okay?" Walter looked up, hastily wiping away his tears with the back of his hand, still clinging to the last shreds of dignity. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking as he gathered his scattered papers. "It's just my wife, Margaret. She needs her medication, the new cancer treatment. And they won't." His voice cracked as he gestured weakly toward the bank's entrance. Mahira was already kneeling beside him, helping him gather the fallen papers. As she picked up a photograph, a team picture from Millbrook High's championship season, her eyes widened. "Dad, look. He's Coach Thompson. They were talking about him at camp today." Shaquille's expression shifted, the pieces finally coming together. The stories he had heard about a coach who had dedicated his life to the community, who'd never turned away a child who couldn't afford to play, who had worked multiple jobs just to keep youth programs running. Those stories were about this man. The recognition hit hard. Through his tears, Walter explained the situation, the new digital verification requirements, the medication deadline, and his wife waiting at home. Every word seemed heavier than the last. "They treat me like I'm nobody," he whispered. "Like all those years mean nothing. Just because I can't use their smartphone app." Mahira was already on her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she read through the bank's online policies. "Dad, this isn't right," she said, her voice filled with the certainty of a teenager who understood justice and injustice clearly. "They can't just..." Before she could finish, Shaquille made his decision. The mention of medication and treatment struck a deeply personal chord. Having lost his own sister to cancer, Shaq understood the pain and urgency. He extended his hand to Walter. "Coach Thompson, let's go back in there together," he said, helping the elderly man to his feet. Sometimes people need a reminder that behind every policy, there's a person. As they made their way toward the bank's entrance, other customers began to notice. Phones came out, whispers spread, and soon social media was buzzing with the unfolding story. The glass doors slid open, and the bank's lobby fell silent as the unlikely trio entered. The NBA legend, the teenage girl recording everything, and the elderly coach, whose dignity seemed to return with every step. Rebecca Stevens, who had just returned to her office, froze in her tracks as she saw them approach. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly. This was no longer just about an elderly man struggling with digital banking. This had become a moment of moral reckoning for an institution that had lost sight of its human purpose in its rush toward modernization. "Miss Stevens." Shaq's deep voice cut through the silence, and everything changed. The tension in the room crackled like electricity as Shaquille O'Neal stood tall in the center of the bank lobby, his voice carrying the same intensity he once brought to championship games. "I think we need to have a conversation about what banking really means to a community," he said. Rebecca's tablet trembled slightly in her hands as she glanced from Shaq to Walter. Her posture stiffened as she straightened her blazer, a reflexive gesture, though it did little to mask her growing unease. "Mr. O'Neal," she began, her corporate training evident in every calculated word. "While I appreciate your concern, there are federal regulations that we simply..." "Let me stop you right there," Shaq interrupted. His 7-foot frame seemed to fill the office as he leaned slightly forward. "I sit on the board of multiple banks. I've been involved in countless mergers and acquisitions. So when you talk about federal regulations, I know exactly what they say, and what they don't say." The other bank employees, who had gathered at the periphery of the scene, visibly paled. What had begun as a simple Monday afternoon had quickly transformed into something resembling a high-stakes courtroom drama, with Shaq acting as both judge and jury, ready to make his move. "Tell me something," Shaq continued, pulling out his phone. "I just pulled up Coach Thompson's history with this bank. 43 years. Never an overdraft. Regular deposits. Consistent patterns. Do they mean nothing to you? Are they not enough to confirm this man's identity?" Mahira, still recording the scene, zoomed in on the stark contrast between her father's modern smartphone and Walter's worn passbook, a powerful visual metaphor for the clash between progress and humanity playing out before them. "You're wasting this man's precious time because a computer is telling you so." Shaq's voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of personal experience. "I know what it means to watch time slip away while bureaucracy moves at its own pace. Every minute we stand here arguing about apps and digital signatures, Coach Thompson's wife is waiting for medication she needs to live." Rebecca's fingers gripped her tablet tighter, but it slipped slightly in her grasp as she felt the mounting pressure. "Sir, I understand the emotional aspect, but do you?" Shaq straightened to his full height, his voice booming with authority. Several bank employees instinctively took a step back. "From where I'm standing," he continued, "and I'm standing pretty tall, I see an institution that's forgotten its purpose. Banking isn't just about securing money, it's about securing trust." He gestured toward the lobby where customers had gathered, phones raised, recording every moment. "Look out there," he said, his voice carrying. "Every person watching this knows Coach Thompson. They trust him with their kids, their futures. But this bank, where he's kept his money for over 4 decades, can't trust him enough to access his own savings." The air conditioning hummed in the sudden silence. Rebecca's face drained of color as she understood the implications. This wasn't just about one customer anymore. It was about the bank's reputation. In an age where a single viral video could undo years of branding, the stakes had never been higher. "Here's what's going to happen," Shaq said, his tone shifting from confrontational to resolutely determined. "We're going to help Coach Thompson access his money today, right now. And tomorrow, you're going to review every policy that puts digital convenience above human dignity. Because if you don't..." He paused, letting the moment hang in the air. "I'll personally help Coach Thompson transfer every penny to a bank that remembers what community means." The threat wasn't just in his words. It was in the hundreds of phones recording outside, in the news vans pulling up to the curb. The story of a beloved coach being denied access to life-saving medication because he couldn't navigate a smartphone app was already going viral. Rebecca glanced down at her tablet, then at Walter's passbook, and finally at the imposing figure of Shaquille O'Neal standing between her and business as usual. In that moment, she knew she had to make a choice. Between corporate policy and human decency, between digital progress and moral responsibility. The clock on the wall read 4:47 p.m. Margaret's medication deadline loomed. And in a small bank office in Middle America, the future of banking itself seemed to hang in the balance. At 4:49 p.m., Rebecca Stevens made a decision that would later be cited in banking industry journals and social media case studies. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for Walter's passbook. "Let's process your withdrawal right now, Coach Thompson," she said, her voice carrying a new note of humanity. "We'll use the emergency override protocol. I'll take full responsibility." As Walter's transaction was being processed, Shaq noticed something familiar on the coach's phone, one of the few modern technologies Walter had embraced. It was an old, faded photo from 1985. Showing a much younger Walter Thompson coaching a lanky teenager who would later play in the NBA. "You coached Marcus Wilson?" Shaq asked, his eyebrows rising in recognition. Walter nodded, a brief smile breaking through his worry. "I taught him that skyhook. You could never block it," he said, momentarily forgetting his troubles as the warmth of the memory surfaced. Shaq let out a deep laugh, breaking the remaining tension. "Man, he gave me fits in '96. That was your signature move." By 4:53 p.m., Walter had his funds. The old man turned to Shaq, his eyes glistening. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Margaret. She's all I have left. This medication. It means everything." Shaq shook Rebecca's hand firmly. "Thank you for doing the right thing," he said, his tone both gracious and meaningful. "Sometimes the biggest assists in life happen off the court." Rebecca nodded, a genuine smile replacing her earlier professional mask. As they walked toward the bank's entrance, Shaq made a quick stop at the ATM. Without fanfare, He withdrew some cash and pressed it into Walter's hand. The old man started to protest, but Shaq raised a hand. "Consider it an investment in the Skyhook legacy," he grinned. Mahira watched as the two men, one towering, one stooped, but both giants in their own ways, shared a final handshake in the fading afternoon light. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest victories aren't won with slam dunks, but with simple acts of human dignity. At that moment, the story became about more than just banking. It was about humanity, dignity, and the simple but powerful reminder that behind every policy, there are real people. Call to action. How would you react if an elderly person was turned away by a clerk just because they're not versed in technology? Do you think the bank should have helped Walter verify his account instead of simply kicking him out? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.